Hi everyone, and welcome to the third lesson in our Macbeth GCSE revision series. In the first lesson, we looked at Macbeth as a character, did a character analysis, lots of key quotes and a model paragraph. We did the same thing for Lady Macbeth last week. And this week, we're going to be diving into Macduff. Next week, most likely, we're going to have a little deep dive on Malcolm, who's one of the other major characters. But actually, we also need to get the witches in there. So probably we'll do witches next week. So with Mcduff, we're going to go through character analysis of him. We're going to do key quotes with him, and then we'll do a model answer with him. So let's get started with that. Where is he? Where have we put Mcduff? Here we go. So the PowerPoint, as I said, was actually the work of one of my previous students, and I love a lot of the artwork that she did. The 90% KFC, this is a reference that we'll get into later. But anyway, so Macduff represents honor and justice. He's one of the Thanes. He's actually the Thane of Fife. So let me just add that in here, Thane of Fife. And so he's one of the most respected and looked up to people in the whole of Scotland. He's very loyal. He is a good Thane to the king, and very close to the king, King Duncan. But once Macbeth becomes king, he does seem to question Macbeth's right to the throne, which makes sense because obviously Malcolm is the rightful heir to the throne, not Macbeth. He doesn't really take to Macbeth as king, and then Macduff is one of the people basically who leads the rebellion against Macbeth, which obviously leads to Macbeth being overthrown and replaced with Malcolm. Malcolm has what's called the Rule of Primogeniture, which basically means that because he's the oldest child of the king, he is the rightful heir to the throne, in the same way as technically Prince Charles should become the next monarch in England if anything were to happen to Queen Elizabeth II. So yeah, he respects the chain of being, he respects the divine right of kings, he respects the law of primogeniture, and that's why he represents honor and justice. He also represents fatherhood and protection. So obviously he is a father and a husband. He risks the lives of his own family for Scotland when he goes to get Malcolm from England. And obviously, tragically, Macbeth does actually kill Macduff's entire family when he is in England talking to Malcolm. It's a very tragic scene. It's probably the most important scene, one of the most important scenes in the whole play, definitely the most important scene for Macduff. He represents protection because he's trying to protect Scotland, and he ultimately becomes a father figure to Malcolm as well. So, you know, Malcolm is a young man. I don't know exactly how old he's meant to be. Let's say he's sort of late teens to early, like young adult, let's say like maybe somewhere between 15 and 20, 25. So when Malcolm's father, Duncan, is killed, he doesn't really have a father figure to help mentor him to be a good king. And so Macduff steps into that role for Malcolm. We'll see a few quotes to do with that as well. Macduff is arguably on a growth arc because he's definitely a dynamic character. I should have put that as well. He's a dynamic character because he does change ultimately with his experiences, and he's quite a complicated character. So he's loyal to Duncan. He's not loyal to Macbeth. He then totally grows and becomes his final form, so to speak, when his family is all killed. And that gives him his new reason to be alive, which is no longer just to protect Scotland, but to avenge his family, his dead wife and children. So that's roughly what Macduff is all about. If you were going to talk about Macduff, these are some of the points or ideas that you could bounce off of. And that's what we'll do in our model paragraph later. So I thought what would be interesting, some people quite liked the whole going through an extract thing, because for a lot of students, it will be an extract-based essay for Macbeth. So we'll just read this extract together, and I'll do a little bit of an analysis of certain ideas. Again, we're just going to focus on how Macduff is presented. With each of the essays, I'm keeping it nice and broad like that. So we'll think about a few ways Macduff seems to be presented in this scene. And I guess I'll read all the parts since I don't have any students with me or they're muted, the ones that are watching, to read this with me. So, your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered. To relate the manner were on the quarry of these murdered deer, to add the death of you. Merciful heaven, what man? Ne'er pull your hat upon your brows, give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the overfraught heart and bids it break. My children too, wife, children, servants, all that could be found. And I must be from hence. My wife killed too, I have said. Be comforted. Let's make us medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief. He has no children. All my pretty ones? Did you say all? Oh, hell kite, all? What? All my pretty chickens and their dame at one fell swoop? Dispute it like a man. I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things were that were most precious to me. Did heaven look on and would not take their part? Sinful Macduff, they were all struck for thee. Not that I am, not for their own demerits, but for mine, fell slaughter on their souls. Heaven rest them now. Be this the whetstone of your sword. Let grief convert to anger, blunt not the heart, enrage it. Oh, I could play the woman with mine eyes and braggart with my tongue. But gentle heavens, cut short all intermission. Front to front, bring thou this fiend of Scotland and myself. Within my sword's length, set him. If he scape, heaven forgive him too. Okay, so this is a dramatic Act 4, Scene 3, going into Act 5, ready for the battle and the final sort of, the final showdown between Macbeth and Macduff and Malcolm. But so in this scene, Ross comes in, he's traveled all the way from Scotland, from Scotland to England to tell Macduff that his family has been murdered. And obviously, imagine Ross's situation there. He would be feeling terrible in this situation. But yeah, he has to tell Macduff the terrible news. And so he does. He says it as best he can. How do you say this nicely? Your wife and babes savagely slaughtered. So you got the sibilance in those lines, which is quite important. We're focusing in on Macduff, but obviously the fact that there's the savagely slaughtered, this adds a lot to Macduff's character as well. Malcolm is obviously really upset to hear this as well. Malcolm comes in to become a very good king. He's like his father Duncan. So he's just like merciful heaven. The exclamatory there just shows the drama of this moment and how traumatic it is. Macduff at this point is completely in trauma. My children too. He's just been told this. And he repeats these lines a couple of times. My children, my wife, all my children. Did you say all? Yeah, he's in a state of deep shock. And you would be, right? If you found out dreadful, unforgivable, terrible news like this, you would be shell-shocked for a minute. You would be in a deep state of trauma. Then the fact that there's the KFC thing, this is a bit of dark humor. The fact he called them his pretty chickens and their dame. So this is metaphor. And the fact that he's called and imagery, and the fact that he calls his children his pretty chickens, it just shows what a loving father he was. He has these little nicknames for his children, and he calls them his pretty chickens. And so obviously the fried chicken is a reference to his kids have been killed. Dark humor. Anyway, so this imagery is just so tragic for us. So tragic to see Macduff having lost his wife and kids. It's awful. Now, his reaction here, when he does have a moment where he actually understands what's going on as well, he has no children. This is one of the most savage quotes in any Shakespeare that you would ever read, or any book you've ever read, really, because why he says this is subtext. He's basically saying, look, if Macbeth had kids, in this moment, I would want to kill his children so that he would feel the pain that I'm feeling right now. Imagine being in so much pain and wanting revenge so badly that your mind goes, at least briefly, to the idea of killing a child to get revenge. That's what he's saying here. That's how deep his pain is. And he moves away from it fairly quickly and just focuses on Macbeth. But that's the level of pain he's in this moment. Then Macduff talks about how he must feel the pain as a man. I must feel it as a man. Now, that's an interesting sort of quote when you think about traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity, which is obviously something that is in the play Macbeth. So men were not really supposed to feel their emotions through tears, you know. They weren't supposed to really show much emotion. But here he kind of actually goes away from that a little bit. And he says, look, I still need to feel this as a man. You know, I still love my children. I still love my wife. And I imagine he got a bit choked up at this point. And I didn't do a very good reading of it because I didn't have anyone to bounce off of. But he's really sad right here. This generates a lot of pathos, a lot of pity for him. So after talking about killing Macbeth's children, which is a pretty big deal, he then talks to God. He says, did heaven look on and would not take their part? So just, and this is a rhetorical question, you could argue that what he says next is kind of answering the question, but he's basically saying, where was God? Why didn't God save my children and save my wife? And you can't really blame him for feeling that way in this moment. You know, you can't blame him, because if your family, God forbid, was taken away from you in a tragic accident, and you were a person that believed in God, then you probably would question God for a minute. You probably would say, where were you, God? Like, why would you let this happen? But then immediately he answers to it, or has a new thought. He says, sinful Macduff, they were struck for thee. So he very quickly goes from blaming God or asking where God was to realizing it was his own fault. And this is because he's left them vulnerable and unprotected. And like I said at the beginning, Macduff puts Scotland ahead of his own family. He risks his family's life. He leaves them vulnerable in order to try and save the whole of Scotland. So how noble a man is that? But he realizes that it was his own failure that has cost them their lives. So he doesn't blame God. He takes accountability for it. And that shows him to be a great leader as well. The fact that he's not going to blame anyone for what happened, other than blaming himself for not protecting them. But then imagine the feeling that you would have if you were a father or mother, or just even like just a friend or someone that you care about, being in a position where you felt like you were responsible for the fact that they were killed or hurt. You would feel awful. And later on, he talks about how the ghosts of his family will continue to like be with him unless he kills Macbeth. That may be true. It might be part of the supernatural. It might be part of this idea that this, you know, is a time where there were, you know, more belief in angels and spirits and so on. But it could also be a psychological thing, right? The psychology of the fact that he realizes the trauma of having left his family like this. They then haunt him in his memories, and they force him to obviously kill Macbeth to get revenge. Malcolm, just a quick one. Be this the whetstone of your sword. A whetstone is what you use to sharpen a sword. So he's basically using this metaphor here to say, look, let this anger convert. Well, he actually literally says this, convert this sadness to anger. Like, let's use this, even though it's a terrible thing, let's use this to benefit us, to get rid of Macbeth. And then Macduff finally finishes by saying, I could play the woman with my eyes and the braggart with my tongue, but cut all intermission, or cut short all intermission. This is a funny little reference because they're in a theatre watching this performance, and the intermission is that middle kind of section in a lot of plays and musicals. If you ever go to see any, there's like a 10 or 15-minute break in the middle usually, and he's just saying cut all that. So the metaphor is, look, let's just get to the end now. So it's kind of funny. Macduff is almost like talking as if he's a character in a play. Just get me to the end. Bring me within my sword's length, set him, right? So this is very graphic imagery. He's literally saying, look, put Macbeth within one sword's length of me and let's see what happens. So now we see that the only reason that Macduff is even alive is to try to get revenge for his family. This becomes his new reason to be, which is also known, fancy word there is raison d'etre from the French, the reason to be. His new reason to be, it's no longer to be a father, because he is unfortunately doesn't have kids anymore, they've all been killed, or a husband, unfortunately his wife is dead. His new raison d'etre, or reason to be, is to kill Macbeth and to get revenge. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time to dive through a few key quotes for him. So we've got, as I said, he has no children, the short sentence, and also the fact that it's the subtext of he wants to kill Macbeth's children. If Macbeth had children, he would go after them. It just shows how deeply hurt he is that he would be even willing to think about doing this. All my pretty chickens, as we said, that's the KFC reference. The fact he calls his little kids pretty chickens, it's like very emotional. We understand that mothers and fathers and friends give each other nicknames and pet names and stuff like that. So the fact that he called his kids his pretty chickens is just devastating to know that they're all dead. And they're so young as well. They were young children. So that just shows how evil Macbeth, even more evil Macbeth has been. Typo here. Sinful Mcduff, they were struck for thee. Like I said, he takes accountability. Moving away from Act 4, Scene 3 into other areas where Macduff is important. At the beginning, or Act 2, when Macbeth is being crowned as the new king after Duncan, Macduff actually says, "Old to Fife." He says, "I'm going to go home," because he's the Thane of Fife. He doesn't go to see Macbeth getting crowned. This is a small but very important quote that shows that basically he isn't really going to be loyal to Macbeth. He doesn't really believe that Macbeth is the best king, even at the very beginning, before Macbeth's done anything wrong. He just knows that he's not supposed to be king. When Malcolm is talking to the soldiers in Act 5 before fighting, Malcolm is basically saying, look, it seems like we're going to win the war very easily. One of the other things that Macduff does, as I said, is he forms a second father figure to Malcolm after Duncan is killed. So Macduff says to Malcolm and the other soldiers, look, put we on industrious soldiership. He's like, look, we don't know if Macbeth is going to win this war or not. All we know is that we can put on industrious soldiership and do everything we can to beat him, to beat Macbeth. So that's him as a father figure. He's advising the young King Malcolm, saying, look, Malcolm, don't rest on your laurels. We don't know what's going to happen. Let's just put on industrial soldiership and make sure that we win. And let's assume that our enemy is strong. You may see things well done here. I'll be totally honest with you. I can't remember why I put this one in at this point. Maybe I'll add a comment in the description later if I can remember. Adieu, lest our old robes sit easier than our new. This is interesting because throughout the play, there are lots of references to clothing as being part of titles. So Macduff is willing to have new people come in to different roles and things. He's flexible to that, but only if they're the right people. Set him within a sword's length, we've already talked about as well. This idea that his new reason to be, his raison d'etre, is to kill Macbeth. I need to add a couple more in here, actually. So all these are portable with other graces weighed. This is when Malcolm is pretending to be a bad king, and Macduff says, you know, look, weighing out your good points and your bad points, you're still a better king. So this shows that Macduff is a very moral person, because later on he says, fit to be king, you aren't fit to live. He's talking to Malcolm and he's saying, you know, your father was a great king, whereas you seem to be a terrible one. So like I said, he's loyal to Scotland. He's not loyal to anyone other than Scotland, to the point that even his own family pay the price for that. And the final one that I wanted to put in is he says to Macbeth at the very end, before he kills Macbeth, surrender, and we'll put you in a freak show and you'll be traveled around the country as a freak, but I will not kill you. Imagine the strength and restraint and the honor that it would take to look at the person who's killed your own family and tell them, you know what, if you surrender, I won't kill you, because ultimately it's for God to decide, not for me, because Macduff is a very godly man and a just man and a religious how would you say that? Like he like I said, he believes in the rule of primogeniture and divine right of kings and chain of being. He wouldn't have believed in killing unless he really had to. So even in the face of the man who killed his children, he gives him a chance. And then it's only Macbeth's arrogance and pride that means that Macbeth doesn't take that offer. He doesn't back down. But Macduff does the right thing the whole time. So there's that. Okay. So how is Macduff presented in Macbeth? We'll do a paragraph here together. I know that these slides are nowhere near as good looking as the slides that my student had created, but what we'll do, we'll just talk about a few ways, like I said, that we could think about him. He represents honor and justice. He represents fatherhood and protection. And I might build that out into a third idea as well, but here are a few ideas for us. Honor, justice, fatherhood, protection, and he represents wisdom, I suppose you could say as well, and grace. I don't know which one of those I want to do most. I think that overall I'll do he represents honor and justice for today. So one of the ways which Shakespeare presents Macduff is as a man who is honorable and just, even in the face of great evil. We see this in the quote, let's see, in the quote, surrender, coward. The short imperative sentence shows Macduff's restraint, since he is faced with the man who has killed his entire family. Macbeth. And yet he is willing to give Macbeth one final chance to repent of all of his crimes and allow him to live. When you consider that in Act 4, Scene 3, we are faced with Macduff lamenting the death of his children in the metaphor, all my pretty chickens, in one fell swoop. The rhetorical question combined with the image of his children as sweet, vulnerable chicks or chickens, which is also a pet net, which we can also infer is a pet name for Macduff to his kids, his children. We feel a great sense of pathos for him, and we question how he is able to show such honor, justice, and restraint in the final act. As the reader, we may look up to Macduff as a true representation of a nobleman and role model. This is significant because when James I became king of England, much of England was unhappy about this. There was a lot of social unrest, and there was even the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes. Macduff's restraint to allow God to make the decision and have justice would have resonated with the mostly Christian population of England in the Jacobean era. There we go. So actually had a couple of minutes left to spare. That's very unlike me. But so do you see how, like usual, we have point, evidence, technique, explanation, reader response, and context. That's what we want to try and do. What I decided to do, and what I recommend you do in your essays, is see if you can combine a couple of different quotes together in your paragraphs, and then link it to something relevant in context if your exam board needs context. Make sure you check that. So yeah, there you go. That's everything. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please comment down below. Next week, as I said, I think we'll be going through the witches, and then we'll start going through themes. And yeah, good work following along today, and I will catch up with you next week.